Alors, bon après-midi à tous. Je m'appelle Joanna O'Reilly et je suis la directrice générale de renouvellement des affaires stratégiques. I'm very pleased to welcome you today and thank you for your participation in the first of 3 workshops actually we're offering as part of the CSB Leaders Path initiative for this fiscal year. J'aimerais tout d'abord reconnaître que je m'adresse à vous depuis Ottawa et que le territoire sur lequel nous sommes réunis est le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. So today's event is part of a series under the Leaders Path initiative, which was implemented in 2019 by the former Business Renewal and Enterprise Architecture Directorate, BRED. So many of you have joined, I'm sure, over the last year and a bit throughout the pandemic and possibly haven't heard of this great initiative. And really, it's about training, it's about development, it's about career advancement, it's about investing in our leaders. However, due to the pandemic over the course of the last year and a half or so, unfortunately, it was put on hold, but we are very pleased to be reinstating the program. We really do see its importance in investing, taking time to invest in ourselves as leaders. Really, that's what it's about. So our Strategic Business Renewal Directorate has taken over the lead, but we are pleased that Ian Skinner, who is also our moderator today, is continuing as champion of this important initiative. Alors, cette année, le parcours des leaders comporte 2 volets principaux, le développement de nos compétences clés en leadership et 3 ateliers liés au leadership. En plus de l'atelier aujourd'hui sur la gestion des risques, nous organiserons 2 autres événements. So we plan 2 other events for this fiscal year that I hope you will return and participate in as well. So we have a workshop of organizational awareness, telling our story. And that provides tips on providing effective result stories to clients and senior management, and that will happen in November. And we have a leadership exchange with the ADM to wrap up the series in February. So again, stay tuned, restez à l'affût pour plus d'informations sur ces ateliers. So please stay tuned for those. Along with the workshops, the Leaders Path continues to help develop and strengthen key leadership competencies, also known as KLCs, which define the expected skills and behaviors of public service leaders.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Leaders Path event for 2021-22. Risk is everyone's business. Bonjour toutes et tous et bienvenue à notre premier événement parcours de leaders de 2021-22, le risque, l'affaire de tous. First, I must acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today on the land which is part of the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Je tiens à reconnaître que je vous parle aujourd'hui sur la terre qui fait partie du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin et Anishinaabe. And those of us who are gathering outside the National Capital Region may also be doing so on the ancestral and unceded territory and homeland of First Nations peoples across the country. Et que ceux d'entre nous qui se réunissent ici de l'extérieur de la région de la capitale nationale le font peut-être sur le territoire ancestral et non cédé et sur la partie de Première Nation dans l'ensemble du pays. As Joanna said, my name is Ian Skinner. I am the champion of Leaders Path. I'm also your moderator for today. Today, we're going to be talking about risk and why it's so important and some strategies and examples that will help us all manage risk in our day-to-day work. Aujourd'hui, nous discuterons de risque, de son importance et de certaines stratégies et de certains exemples pour nous aider à le gérer dans notre travail quotidien. To start today's session, we have 3 presentations. But before I begin, there are some directions that I need to share with you related to today's session. First, please remember to disconnect from the VPN if you haven't already done so. Veuillez ne pas oublier de déconnecter des réseaux privés virtuels. Also, at any time, you can submit your questions to us using the Q&A icon on your screen. You can also upvote any questions submitted by others, which will help us determine which questions are of more interest to participants and also reduce the submission of duplicate questions. The panel will answer your questions after their presentations. Vous pouvez nous envoyer vos questions à tout moment à l'aide de l'icône Q&A à l'écran. Vous pouvez également voter pour les questions envoyées par des autres, ce qui nous aidera à déterminer les questions qui sont le plus intéressantes pour les participants et également diminuer l'envoi de questions en double. Le groupe des experts répondra aux questions après leur présentation. And finally, using the polls icon, we ask participants to please answer the 2 poll questions found there. We will share the results at the end of today's event. Enfin, nous demandons aux participants de répondre aux 2 questions du sondage en utilisant l'icône à cette fin. Nous présenterons les résultats du sondage à la fin de l'événement aujourd'hui. Now, to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joseph Mikhail. Joseph has a bachelor's degree in biology, but shifted into philosophy for his graduate degree, specializing in philosophy of biology and bioinformatics. He started at Health Canada in 2006 and has worked in the business analyst positions at Pest Management Regulatory Agency and the Health Products and Food Branch. En février de cette année, il s'est joint à la Direction générale des services ministériels à titre de gestionnaire de la division de renouvellement et de la transformation des activités. Aujourd'hui, Joseph fera une présentation générale sur l'identification de l'évaluation et la gestion des risques. Bienvenue, Joseph, et je passe la parole à vous.
And maybe Ian, sorry, can I just jump in? I apologize. It's the symbol of a virtual world, but I apologize that I did get kicked off for a second, but as a good moderator, as you are, you jump right in and take over. So that's great. So I just wanted to finish to say thank you everyone for participating. Looking forward to a great session. Merci à vous tous pour participer aujourd'hui, and I'll pass it over to Joe. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Joanna and Ian. I'm just going to share my presentation here. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. So risk management is probably one of the most low topics, not only to learn, but also to apply. We don't want to think about the ways our decisions, processes, and projects can go wrong. However, risk management is a very important element in developing leadership. J'espère donc que ces présentations vous les montreront et vous donneront aussi de bons points de départ sur la façon d'appliquer correctement les techniques de gestion des risques. First, we need to start with some definitions to make sure we are all talking about the same thing. Most simply, risk is the potential exposure to an event, usually adverse, at any time. Easiest example I can think of, if you go biking, there is a risk that you will fall. Risk is ever present in all decision-making, from simple personal risks, such as getting out of bed, to complex organizational risks, such as disaster relief coordination. However, we tend to manage such risks unconsciously, since they are part of our routine tasks, such as day-to-day operational duties, or the risks are relatively low, such as minor improvements to policies and processes. Because it is ever present and unconscious, we tend to forget that we are constantly risk managing. Quand les risques sont réalisés, ils deviennent des problèmes. En utilisant l'exemple du vélo, lorsque vous tombez de votre vélo, cela devient un problème, comme une blessure ou des dommages à votre vélo. So, the goal of risk management is to avoid issues or reduce their impact. Of course, we all don't want issues to happen in the first place. So the best way to avoid them is to identify them and plan accordingly. Let's dive a bit into why we should manage risks. First, as mentioned in the previous slide, risk management helps us to prevent surprise issues from arising. It can lessen their potential impact and/or properly prepare for any resulting issues. I hope everyone agrees that it's better that with better planning and preparation comes better outcomes. Second, risk management helps in proper decision-making. For example, if you know that option 1 has more risks than option 2, you may opt for option 2. Keep in mind, however, that this is not as simple of an equation as it sounds, since often we may choose the riskier option if it yields greater benefits. Finally, the recognition of risks can lead to innovative ways to approach potential issues before they occur. We've all heard of the phrase, see challenges as opportunities. History is full of examples where great risks presented themselves to greater outcomes. Classic examples include the Greek horse accepted by the Trojan and Hannibal crossing the Alps. So, how do we manage risk? Well, of course, we all generally use informal approaches that utilize common sense, experience, or our gut. We use our common sense to determine the obvious risks or well-known challenges. I don't like the term in common sense, by the way, because it's thrown around loosely, and we all have different definitions as to what that means. I prefer the term experience over common sense. We use what we've learned, either directly or indirectly, to determine and manage risks. Experience is a very powerful tool since they often arise from our past issues, which means that we've dealt with significant risks in the past. Finally, we can use our gut, which is also often called our instincts or intuition or second nature. I prefer the term second nature. Aristotle was the first that I know of that coined this term and defined it as what we learn through experience, though no longer having conscious awareness of. For example, riding a bike is second nature. We originally had to learn how to balance on two wheels, but now know how to do it unconsciously. When assessing risks, we sometimes feel as though an option is riskier than another based on unconscious assessments. I want to look into the term instincts a bit more because it's a popular term that is dear to most people. We often are proud of ourselves when we follow our instincts or look up to people who are able to make great decisions in their lives by simply following their guts. First, there have been a couple of very popular books written about the subject lately, including Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow and fellow Canuck Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. I like Kahneman's book better since he and his famous colleague Amos Tversky have studied decision-making for decades and are giants in several fields, including decision-making, social psychology, and behavioral economics. In his book, Kahneman compares slow, data-driven analysis with the quick heuristic techniques when using one's instincts. They found that instincts work well in specific cases, such as military tactics and medical decisions. Typically, in cases where detailed analysis is not possible due to the urgency of their situations. The part of our brain that processes information unconsciously is much quicker since it uses parallel neuronal connections versus the part of our brain which processes information consciously, which uses serial neuronal connections. However, one thing you'll notice is that the informal method of using one's instincts is best done by experts who have consciously assessed similar situations countless times. They avoid information overload, and their unconscious brains are able to focus on information that is relevant and important. So apart from these urgent, high-stakes situations that are handled by experts, in which situations are informal risk management assessments sufficient? Eh bien, une évaluation détaillée des risques n'est pas nécessaire dans de nombreux cas, car elle sera inefficace. For example, for day-to-day tasks, a detailed risk assessment is not needed. However, risk assessment may be needed related to the standard operating procedures related to those tasks. Also, most decisions we make involve very minor risks with little to no impact. Although a detailed risk assessment is not required, the least that may be needed is explicit recognition of the potential risks, often through weighing pros and cons, and proposed measures for managing those risks. Enfin, comme nous l'avons mentionné, il n'est pas nécessaire de procéder à des évaluations détaillées des risques dans les situations d'urgence. So we look quickly at informal risk management. We only glance at it quickly since I don't believe that we can teach how to use your gut or instincts. As mentioned, researchers seem to agree that such instincts are reliable only when experts are using them in their relevant areas of expertise. What can be taught, however, is formal risk management. The formal approach uses specific processes and is dependent upon objective analysis in order to identify, measure, and manage risk. Même si l'approche formelle comporte des étapes très précises, il n'est pas nécessaire de les suivre dans tous les cas, comme il est décrit dans cette présentation. D'ailleurs, la sensibilisation à ces mesures peut nous aider à faire de meilleures évaluations informelles. Risk and its formal management has been studied extensively. There are many different methods, especially as applied to different fields of study. we will look at a more general method, which can be easily applied for most of the work we do in the public service. Alors, quand la gestion officielle de risque est-elle nécessaire? Most importantly, formal risk management is required in novel situations that allow for detailed analysis. Best way to think of it is a project you have been assigned that allows you to determine the end date of that project based upon the level of effort. Formal risk assessment is an essential tool in any organization for the processes, projects, and decisions that have significant impacts. In the public service, risk management is especially essential in order to maintain public trust. Without formal risk management and its associated documentation, in situations where projects fail, it becomes visible that decisions were made without considering consequences. I'm sure many of us can think of examples of this either in our own experiences or from the news. Quelles sont les étapes de la gestion officielle des risques? Elles comprennent ce qui suit, que nous allons examiner en détail. Context and environmental scan, risk identification, risk measurement and assessment, response to risk, and finally, risk monitoring and control. Starting with context and environmental scan. This is something that we typically do with processes and projects anyway, and is a precursor to risk management. The purpose of the context and environmental scan is to identify internal and external factors that have an impact on the decision, process, or project. It's basically trying to figure out everything you're working on before you get started. For example, when doing renovations, you need layout, plans, costs, resources, etc. In organizations, environmental scans include business requirements, project plans, and detailed diagrams that identify all causes, effects, linkages, and dependencies. It is important to consider items not only within one's shop, but across all stakeholder groups. Also, it's very important to not only consider the normal processes, but also all the possible exceptions. Such scans can be accomplished by internal teams, such as subject matter experts, but often consultants are hired to run more complex scans, ones that need detailed research. Although all those steps are important, I'd like to note that I found this one to be one of the steps that often cause many issues if not properly completed. I've often gotten to the end of a project and have issues come up due to exceptional cases that were not taken into account during the environmental scan. Once we know what we're working with, the next step is to identify all potential risks. During risk identification, we need to develop clear and concise risk statements, which will serve as the basis for future actions and decisions. To put it into a nice equation, risk statements include risk factors, the risk itself, along with the consequences. Par exemple, une instruction peut ressembler à ceci. The risk factor is, because of pressure to limit costs, the risk is, it may not be possible to meet the requirements for the renovation of laboratories. As such, the consequence is that it may cause a delay in obtaining regulatory approvals. Here's a diagram that kind of shows different ways that we can identify risks. Once you have all your risk statements, you can now move on to risk measurement and assessment. The purpose of such measurement and assessment is to consider two measures. First, the impact of the risk, meaning how serious will the consequences be should the risk actually happen. The second is the probability of the risk, meaning how likely is it that the risk will materialize. The relationship between risk impact and probability can be illustrated using a risk exposure chart, also known as a heat map. As you can see on the chart, the gradient goes from very low, very minor, to very high and very serious. In this step, you determine where each of your risks fall within this spectrum. I've included an example here where we're updating an application process from PDF forms to online e-forms, something maybe many of us have done in our organizations over the past few years. The first identified is that the new e-forms will have bugs. I've classified this as high probability, given that bugs are almost a certainty with any new IT project, and high impact, given that such bugs can curtail the application process. The second risk identified is that the new forms will be difficult to understand by the users. We've given this a medium probability because they should be somewhat similar to the old forms, but now they have a new interface. We've also given this a medium impact since it won't curtail the application process, just slow it down and cause frustration. Finally, a third risk we've identified is that the process will need to be significantly updated to match the new e-forms. This is high probability since processes are almost always updated with new technology. It's also high impact since new processes always require new training, new SOPs, and other change management requirements. So now that we've identified the risks and assessed their probabilities and impacts, it's time to determine how we're going to respond to each of these risks. The purpose of determining the responses is to find the appropriate response, and as there are many different types. How we respond to risks depend upon the context of the risk, our tolerance for each particular risk, the value of our response, its associated costs, along with many other factors. Parmi les réponses, il y a trois catégories principales. Les voici. That the risk is acceptable or suitable, so nothing is needed to respond to it. That the risk is unacceptable or unsuitable. In these cases, there are a number of strategies available to mitigate the risk. Finally, the risk is unacceptable and or unsuitable, but it was determined that nothing can be done to mitigate the risk. In each of these cases, by determining how we can respond to each risk, we can better estimate the level of effort in terms of costs and resources that is required to be added to a project. From these three main categories, there are a number of more specific strategies that one can respond to the risk. In this table, we will identify the strategy, the definition, and provide an example. I'm just going to go over these really quickly, given that there are a number of these and the presentation will go on for too long if I go through each one by one. But you can see the different strategies have different definitions, and I have examples here as well. For example, we can accept the risk, we can mitigate it, we can transfer it to a third party, we can try to avoid it, we can share the risk with another group or another project if needed, we can develop contingency plans, or my favorite, we can work on enhancing and exploiting the risk so that we actually find a way to turn this into an opportunity like I mentioned before. Here, I give a case study, again, with the PDF, transferring them to e-forms. In each of the cases, I've identified the risks, I've given a measurement for each of the risks, and the response to each of these risks. You'll notice that in a couple of these, I've decided to enhance and exploit the risk that we've identified. Once all the risks have been established, we can now run with our processes or project. At this stage, though, we will not need to monitor and control the risks. The purpose of this stage is to monitor the progression of each risk. Whether there are new risks, report consistently on various risks, and communicate as needed. Les risques doivent être réévalués régulièrement. Nous devons identifier les nouveaux risques au besoin, mesurer et évaluer de nouveau les risques existants et examiner nos réponses. If any of the risks become issues, then our various response plans can handle them appropriately, be they by accepting, mitigating, or exploiting the issues. The formal approach to risk management is daunting. Par conséquent, souvent, la gestion officielle de risque n'est pas entreprise pour diverses raisons. There are extra steps, resources, costs needed to identify, analyze, and manage risks. Risk management takes time and money away from actually completing tasks, and many times people view risk management as delaying projects. Psychologically, there are some biases that can hinder risk management. For example, most of us suffer from an optimism bias, where we don't think bad things will happen to us and our efforts. We have an illusion of invulnerability, where sometimes entertain a personal fable about our above average capabilities. This is called the Lake Wobegon effect, where we all believe we are above average in who we are and what we do. Also psychologically, we may hold the belief that if we identify risks, that they will inevitably manifest themselves. Bad things need to be ignored, and we need to focus on the positives. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one because there's a few I missed. There's also various sociological effects that prevent proper risk management. For example, by assessing risk, we may be afraid of appearing indecisive. Eh bien, nous pouvons être fatigués de l'aversion au risque du gouvernement. Or finally, we may be afraid of committee decisions or over-analysis. We think that these phenomena present themselves in poor decisions. We want to be the leaders that can quickly ingest the important information and be able to quickly and confidently provide ironclad solutions that have little to no risk. Doesn't that sound amazing if we can all be like that? Unfortunately, the myth of the individual making decisions that are superior to those of the committees is just that, a myth. We wouldn't have wanted Neil Armstrong or the head of NASA to decide and make all the decisions related to the Apollo program, for example. Similarly, we don't want all decisions made by one person at the top without any input from anyone else. In order to overcome these barriers, here are a few counter proposals. By properly analyzing, preparing for, and managing risks, your organization truly becomes proactive rather than reactive. Don't we all complain that we're constantly putting out fires? Wouldn't it be nice to instead be prepared for issues that potentially arise? Although risk management adds extra work up front, it saves a lot of work down the road. Some of you may have heard the expression going fast by going slow. This is a modern analog to Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare. This applies very well to risk management. By carefully considering all possible risks, you can effectively react to them should they materialize. Le leadership ne se précipite pas aveuglément et n'écarte pas les problèmes potentiels. Il avance avec de sagesse et confiance. Being aware of and prepared for risks is different from being risk averse. It actually allows you to take on greater risks by ensuring we can potentially handle them, appropriately handle them. Let's all work towards foresight rather than hindsight. Let's anticipate the issues rather than playing should have after the fact. Many think leadership is the ability to make decisions fast, being decisive, not requiring detailed analyses. We have images of generals storming the front, never looking behind, ignoring the so-called experts, and not worried about the consequences. Again, this may work in urgent cases where the decision maker is experienced in that field. However, hopefully we all know that the decision-making is a much more complex affair. What often seems like silly decisions from the outside is actually often a decision that was carefully assessed based on risks and variables that are specific to the situation and only clearly understood by those working on the problem. As our problems become more complex and difficult to navigate, so do our decisions and their associated risks. Do not make the mistake decision delay with indecisiveness, but rather with lucid, measured, and conscientious analysis. One of the best ways to truly champion risk management is to keep Murphy's Law in mind. Anything that can possibly go wrong does. Although versions of Murphy's Law have been contemplated for millennia, the law itself is named after the engineer Edward Murphy. In the 1950s, he developed tools to measure acceleration for the US Air Force when they were testing the human tolerance for G-forces by strapping the tools to rocket sleds. Initially, when Murphy and the Air Force developed the law, it was meant to ensure that all possible risks were accounted for. It was a positive law, rather than the negative connotation that it has since acquired. Murphy's Law was meant to encourage excellence, rather than stoking cynicism. Reconnaître que nous sommes souvent prédisposés psychologiquement à ignorer les risques. En nous, en tenant objectivement et sans préjuger aux données, nous sommes en mesure de prendre de meilleures décisions. Failure to account and manage risk can lead to increased program costs, missed opportunities, and compromised program outcomes. It can also impact the credibility of the public service. If you're still uncomfortable with thinking about all the ways something can go wrong, another popular saying can help. Expect the best, but prepare for the worst. Il y a bien sûr beaucoup de ressources disponibles pour développer davantage ces talents de gestion de risque. L'École de la fonction publique du Canada offre de nombreux cours d'excellence, dont plusieurs en ligne. J'en ai énuméré quelques-uns ici. There's also a few excellent books that became bestsellers. I've already mentioned Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. His book, which summarizes decades of Nobel Prize-winning research, focuses mainly on how our brains are quite flawed to handle our modern complex world, and that we make better decisions when we properly analyze the relevant data. Next, Peter Bernstein's Against the Gods, The Remarkable Story of Risk, is a book about humanity's constant battle against the forces of fate. This is a fight that has existed for millennia, and in each epoch, influenced by the dominant ideology of the time, we have dealt with risk differently. Bernstein outlines the evolution of our different perceptions of risk and shows how the success of the modern world is due to paradigm-shifting ideas from mathematicians, biologists, and economists. He showed that what makes modern society different from the past is the mastery of risk. Finally, Nassim Taleb's The Black Swan is one of the most praised nonfiction books written in the past century. It teaches one to build robustness to negative events and develop the ability to exploit positive events. So to summarize, la risque est partout, et nous gérons tous les risques tous les jours de manière informelle. In order to better handle larger decisions, processes, and projects, we need to employ formal risk management practices. Remember the 5 steps, which are context and environmental scan, risk identification, risk measurements and assessment, response to risk, and risk monitoring and control. Recognize the barriers to risk management. These include resource barriers, where we don't have time or money to manage those risks, psychological barriers, such as the optimism bias, and sociological barriers, such as the fear of appearing indecisive. The best way to make risk management an essential part of your processes is to remember Murphy's Law, but see it in a positive light rather than a negative one. Being aware and prepared for what can go wrong will help ensure that your endeavors are successful. Merci.
Merci, Joseph. What's interesting about the presentation that you just shared with us, I'm glad that you spoke to the definition of common sense, because many of us can find examples where common sense is not so common. The other part that I'd like to acknowledge, Joseph, is the fact that we deal with risk every day, from the moment we step out of our beds and head to our offices, that short 30-foot commute. There's a risk involved in that. What's fascinating is that when we get to a business or organizational context, we seem to forget that risk is just a natural part of living and doing business. Just want to remind folks that you can submit your questions via the Q&A icon on your screen. Donc, vous pouvez donner des questions sur l'icône sur votre écran Q&A. Next, we have Scott McKenna. Scott is known to all of us. He is the CIO of the health portfolio. He assumed that role late in November 2019, just ahead of a small wave called a pandemic. I have to tip my hat to Scott and the folks in IMSD for the way that they've truly navigated those turbulent waters, which in essence have become a tsunami. You know, Scott has worked with, has been with Health Canada throughout his career in various management roles in IT, program and corporate services, both in the regional and national roles. And he has a long history in business transformation. Aujourd'hui, Scott nous parlera de son expérience en évaluation des risques et de l'importance de celle-ci lors de la prise de décision au sein de la DGSJI, excuse-moi, et présentera également des cas qui illustrent comment l'évaluation de la probabilité d'un résultat et de son incidence potentielle pour éclairer la prise de décision. Scott, I hand the virtual microphone over to you.
Merci, Ian, and it's kind of funny. Thanks for the introduction. I don't think we needed to have all that, but you and I have had many conversations about risk over the years. So I'm really happy to be here, folks. Bienvenue tout le monde, and so glad that so many of you have taken your time from your incredibly busy schedules, and we all know, and I want to acknowledge that, how busy we all are to attend today. C'est un sujet très important, car nous évaluons tous les risques en prenant des décisions quotidiennement. Je suis ravi d'être ici aujourd'hui et de partager quelques-unes de mes réflexions avec vous. J'espère que vous repartirez d'ici avec des informations pratiques et que vous serez en mesure d'appliquer certaines de ces informations à vos activités. For me, being able to understand the level of risk and the probability of it occurring is really the key. It is only then that you can make an informed decision based on whether you have the accountability and level of authority, and that's what I'm going to focus on a bit, and whether you have the accountability and level of authority to accept that risk, or if you may need to make a recommendation to your manager who has the authority to make the decision based on level of risk. Knowing the culture of your environment is critical. You know, different cultures, different environments have different risk tolerance. So what is the risk tolerance of our departments, of our senior leadership, of your immediate manager? Really key things to consider if you want to process the pieces of information that Joseph shared with us earlier. But we do that really quickly when we make these decisions. As Ian said, we do it on a daily basis. So understanding the delegated authority and accountabilities of your position, as well as those in positions above you, is paramount. Being able to assess risk and impacts helps you in determining, do I have the authority to make this decision or not? Permettez-moi de vous donner un exemple simple. Aucun d'entre vous et nous ne signerait pas un contrat, au moins d'avoir le pouvoir de signature approprié pour le type et le montant du contrat. C'est facile. C'est parce que vous savez que vous avez besoin d'une délégation financière pour ces décisions. C'est aussi parce que vous avez évalué le risque et que signer sans l'autorité déléguée a des conséquences graves. Hey, Joseph, I have a graphic, Joseph, you can pull it up on the screen for a bit, and then we can put it off. J'ai un graphique sur les risques, les probabilités et l'impact, que j'aime vraiment, car il est simple, mais puissant. Je l'ai trouvé sur LinkedIn il y a certain temps, mais ça résonne toujours en moi. We can quickly look at it, just a comical graphic of really 4 pieces of high probability. The first one's high probability, low impact. You know what? Most likely going to happen, very little impact. So we consider those things all the time. The second one, low probability, low impact. Probably low probability, we can probably good chance to avoid it. Low impact if it happens. The third one's low probability, high impact. May not happen, you know, good chance it won't happen, but if it does, it could be painful. And the fourth one there is high probability, high impact. You know, very likely to occur, and when it does, we're probably going to feel some pain from that. So I'll use those maybe to illustrate a couple of examples I have as we move forward. J'ai 3 exemples réels qui se sont produits pendant la pandémie, qui illustrent les risques dans la prise de décision. Tout d'abord, regardons l'illustration 3 sur l'image, probabilité fiable, impact élevé. For those who were with us just prior to the onset of the pandemic and the directive to work from home on March 29, 2020, excuse me, in late February, the network was down in Health Canada and the agency for approximately 1 week. It was very painful for us all, and it was a tough experience. But that was due to an old network component, piece of IT equipment, a firewall that SSC was making a change to and did not come back on. Serious consequences. Prior to the work from home in March, our network only had the capacity for 4,000 concurrent connections. And even then, even with 4,000, that's the message we told, it did not perform well. Of over 3,000 were connected, and many people have experienced that when trying to have, during those times where we really needed it, certain emergencies, or even sometimes during snowstorms. Given this, we were planning an upgrade to our infrastructure for our VPN to double the capacity to 8,000 concurrent connections, as the pandemic was just hitting Canada. We knew we had the need for remote work. We didn't know it would increase as per the announcement, where we're all going through today, but we knew it would only increase as we move forward. Even in the areas immediately at that point in time, such as we were repatriating Canadians, more inspections, and even work at the border. So on Friday, March 13th of 2020, in response to our planning, SSC wanted to make a change to our infrastructure, and it included making changes to the firewalls. So we think of this as a technical problem, and a lot of folks in our world think of that, from the what's the technical risk, what's the technical problems could happen. So normally these changes are fairly routine, and the risk is low probability of a problem. But given we just had no outage for 7 days, it was very sensitive. Speaking to our technical folks, both internally in our organization and with SSC, they had some good plans in detail and thorough, and they really felt confident in the change. And they assessed the risk to be very low and impact to be very low. Personally, when I engaged in the conversation, I had the impact to be very high. And we had a conversation about that. And when this is how, bring the perspective. What's the context you're coming from? What's the perspective you're bringing? And the actual impact was, the question I asked to ourselves and the SSC, are we, SSC and ourselves, prepared to have the network go down in the middle of a pandemic? The consequence of that actually isn't just some network fix and even our employees being down, which is severe. But ultimately, it's we prepared to have the Minister of Health and the Minister of Digital answer questions in the House of Commons to justify making a technical network change and bringing down the network across Health Canada and the agency during a pandemic. High impact. So we need to understand those things, and low risk was deemed low risk, serious impact, because that's exactly the questions our ministers would have faced. We're trying to be in the middle of a pandemic when we made a conscious decision to do something. How important was that technical change? So we thoroughly reviewed the plans, including the contingency, and felt the risk was still low probability, but given the high impact, I was not prepared to make this decision. I don't have the authority to make that decision. So I brought the decision to my senior management, discussed the plans, contingencies, discussed the impact of not proceeding, gave my recommendation to proceed, but decision was made at a higher level than myself to go ahead and proceed. Work went ahead, was completed by Saturday afternoon that weekend, and little did we know how much it was needed. That Sunday evening, the decision was made by our employer to work remotely and send everyone to work from home. So our capacity was still not great at that point in time, but so much better than if we hadn't done it. And eventually increased by the end of May to support all of Health Canada, in fact, and the story continues. But it's a really good example of, a small minor piece in someone's area. We may think it's a minor issue, minor impact. Do we really understand, look at the real impact of that and put the whole context in perspective? Really, really important. So that was a great example when we talk about risk. Mon deuxième exemple est l'illustration 4 sur l'image, probabilité élevée, impact élevé. So in the spring 2020, the GC, as I just mentioned, was all asked to work remotely. We had limited infrastructure, limited connectivity, and limited collaboration tools. So all of us as employees could work effectively remote and virtually. The Government of Canada quickly responded and put in place an M365 platform collaboration tool using MS Teams for collaboration to offer to all departments across the Government of Canada, because we didn't have the infrastructure in place, and rapidly deploy it by early May. So we had to make a choice. We had to make a choice where we're putting our levels of attention and efforts. Whether we wanted to rapidly deploy this temporary version of MS Teams only for use with unclassified information, but also providing employees a tool to collaborate virtually. Given the limited access to network availability, the important work going on across Health Canada and the agency, both regular work, but even heightened with our respective roles in responding to the pandemic. The risk of sensitive information above unclassified being shared in this environment, both files and discussion, was extremely high. We had no other alternative way to work. So that's the things we had to consider. It was extremely high. We had to balance, do we give people the tools so they can function versus the risk of sensitive information being put out. Compte tenu du travail important dans lequel nos deux ministères ont été et sont toujours impliqués, l'impact sur nos ministères et le gouvernement du Canada dans son ensemble a été très élevé. We made the decision to put our efforts not to go there because the risk was too high and the probability was too high. We made the decision to put our efforts towards implementing our own 365 platform internally that was secure up to protected B level, to ensure that we had the information that we could protect to this level because of that risk was so high. So we continue to promote awareness of information to employees and the appropriate use of tools. We continued our efforts to increase our network infrastructure while we focused on providing a platform that was secure enough that we felt to protect most of our information that was being used when we could work effectively. Et comme vous le savez, nous avons déployé MS Teams à Santé Canada et à l'agence d'ici juin 2020 et continuons d'ajouter de nouvelles fonctionnalités et capacités utilisées par nous tous. Et finalement, un troisième exemple is one high probability, low impact. So, although incredible work, and we compliment our teams and SSC, incredible work has been done to increase our infrastructure capacity, both our VPN and our internal network in the offices. We continue to have challenges due to the incredible growth across our departments, especially since February of this year in those timelines. I'm sure many of you experience that. This is ongoing, and sometimes our video freezes. We get kicked off the VPN. That's serious, and it really impacts each and every one of us. We know it is happening, and thus it's high probability. We know this is happening on a daily basis, so it's high probability. But it's also something that in the big scheme of things has low impact. So we're working to increase our infrastructure for current as well as the future. In the interim, we've decided to accept the day-to-day challenges which impact all of us. The only other option is to restrict access to our network, which is not a great solution given the amount of work and importance of all of our work going on across both of our departments. So we accept that risk that we're going to have daily challenges at the individual level, frustrations, absolutely. But in the big piece, we're able to get back on, we can get our work done, the connectivity is there, we can all still work and function. With a little bit of frustration. Trust me, I have it myself all the time. So I wanted to share those three examples, just the things that we deal with all the time, you deal with all the time. Risk is something we assess without even thinking about it on a daily basis. But I wanted to illustrate those because I thought they were really examples that would resonate with us all given the current situation. So just in closing, just hopefully those examples have helped to share how we can assess risk quickly, make risk-based, have we all make risk-based decisions every day. And I'll leave you with 3 points to consider. So this is where I started. Just understand the culture of your environment, specifically the risk tolerance level. It's extremely important to understand the culture, because cultures are different and are unique. Secondly, before making that decision, assess the risks, both the probability of happening as well as the impact, and not just the impact where the roles you normally take. Try to look at the broader impact. What's the real impact of that going down? And then finally, it's fundamental to make good choices. Determine if it's within the accountabilities of your position and the authorities of your position to make the decision considering the level of risk. Do you have the authority to make that decision, or do you need to assess it and then escalate it to someone else? It's fundamental we do that for we make good decisions and be great public servants. Et c'est tout. Merci Ian et retour à toi, mon ami.
Donc, merci beaucoup, Scott. Merci pour des bons exemples parce qu'ils sont réels. Right now, we are living in times when risk and proper risk assessment really, truly matters. When you think about the role that Health Canada and the Public Health Agency are playing in terms of responding to this pandemic, it's critical that good decisions are made and good decisions come from good analysis of risk. So thank you for that, Scott. Very, very useful and very apropos. Just a reminder, folks, that there is a poll. Don't using the polls icon underneath the more icon that's on your screen. If you click that, there are 2 poll questions that you can find there. We're going to share the results at the end of the session. Donc, nous demandons aux participants de répondre à deux questions de sondage en utilisant l'icône à cette fin. Nous présenterons les résultats de sondage à la fin de l'événement. So next up we have, please allow me, donc, permettez-moi de vous présenter Bolaji Laflamme Lagoquet. Bolaji a obtenu son baccalauréat en psychologie avant de terminer son maîtrise en travail social et une formation supplémentaire de niveau supérieur en santé de la population. Il a débuté à Santé Canada en 2014 et travaille depuis lors au service d'aide aux employés. Bolaji a été conseiller et agent d'orientation dans le cadre du programme d'aide aux employés avant de faire partie de l'équipe de mesures et interventions d'urgence psychosociale de 2017 à 2019. Aujourd'hui, Bolaji discutera de l'étude des risques associés à la prestation des services de consultation dans le cadre du programme d'aide aux employés au PAE de Santé Canada. Bienvenue, Bolaji. Je passe la parole à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Ian. Thank you very much. And I will be sharing my presentation. So thanks for having me. Essentially, so I'm the Quality Assurance Supervisor with EAP Health Canada, and EAP is under the Employee Assistance Services. So it's a distinct operation in that we're nested within the government, but we operate on a cost recovery basis, delivering services that exist in the private sector. And so we share industry standards of service delivery with the private sector. So as a matter of fact, we're accredited by the Council on Accreditation, which is the leading accreditation body in North America for organizations providing human services. Now, compliance with these accreditation standards covers all aspects of operations, including service best practices, ethics, program governance, facilities management, human resources and training, financial practices and audits, overall program quality assurance, and risk management principles and practices. So EAP has to manage risk internally, but we do have a number of external checks as well. Although there are quite a few business processes involved in all of EAP's operations, we'll be focusing on how risk management can be applied to a clinical setting where mental health services are provided. So if we simplify how EAP works, at least for the sake of this presentation, we get this 4-step model. So starting with the contracting or onboarding of mental health professionals working in private practice, and then the various activities involved in training and preparing those mental health professionals to work within an EAP within our program specifically, and delivering the service of short-term solution-focused counseling to clients. And hopefully the result is that clients experience better mental health outcomes. But in reality, there are quite a few moving parts, and this is really an oversimplification of how EAP works. So I'm not expecting anyone to really read what's up here, but it's just pointing out that there can be quite a few moving parts, and we can see how with so many elements, there are many opportunities for risk. So some risks associated specifically with EAP can include client dissatisfaction with services, issues with privacy and confidentiality, a mismatch between client and counselor, professional misconduct, either perceived or real, and an inability to address client concerns within the established mandate of the program. So there's some form of risk management happening at every activity or even interface between activities at EAS. There are measures taken to ensure that new mental health professionals meet minimum qualifications. So we require at least a master's degree, at least 5 years of experience in private practice, professional registration, and liability insurance. And procedures to ensure that clients are matched appropriately with mental health professionals. So a recent example of this is trying to mitigate risk in this area is how we try to focus our efforts on diversifying our network. So we looked at SGBA plus reports, and we sent out surveys to our counselors to gather essential and demographic information about them, but also about their proficiency in working with diverse populations. So members of the LGBTQ2S community, ethnocultural minorities, Aboriginal populations, etc. We do have quality assurance protocols to ensure that clients who may not have felt that it was a proper match are promptly reassigned. And we do have reminders of policies for counselors to ensure that their continued compliance with our policies. And actually one of our more intense activities or intensive activities is the case management of files. So we do have full-time case managers who support our network mental health professionals by having individual and personalized consultations to ensure that cases are handled according to protocol. And this serves as an important role in mitigating risk. And we do collect client satisfaction data. This is very important, something we do on a regular basis. So we have client satisfaction surveys. They can be conducted over the phone, via mail-in survey, and online. So we measure satisfaction and we explore reports of client wellness before and after they use the program. So this data provides a foundation for our improvement strategies moving forward. Now, there's no deliberate risk management exercise at EAS using the formal risk management steps that were enumerated previously in Joseph's presentation, but we do have some practices and protocols that resemble some of them. So I'll try to compare here. So for a context and environmental scan, essentially what we do is we look at reports of critical events impacting various communities. We examine utilization data, client satisfaction data, internal and external reports and recommendations from external entities. This includes our industry accreditation body. And our goal is to measure the program's performance at every activity, starting even before we pick up the phone. So for example, our grade of service scores measures our ability to answer the phone within our self-imposed limit of 18 seconds for crisis calls. For risk identification, so a closer examination of qualitative and quantitative data provides us with important insights on any issues with processes and outcomes. For risk measurement and assessment, so we use data gathering tools to further understand the scope of the risk and its dimensions. And response to risk, so once we understood the risk, we can then explore ways to respond to solutions. And essentially for risk monitoring and control, we focus on surveillance. So it's important to point out that these are not necessarily cut and dried discrete steps. So data gathering is something that is done throughout the entire process. It's an iterative process where we return to our measurements once we get new data, and we reevaluate once we have our prospective solutions. So I'll give a concrete example here of this at EAP. So for context, an environmental scan, it can reveal that there's a possibility of us not having enough mental health professionals in a given region to meet the increased demand for counseling support. So this has happened. And so the risk essentially, our surveys and internal utilization data can help us determine that clients may not always be able to access the services within our target 3 to 5 business days. And our risk statement would be something like, because demand for mental health professionals exceeds supply, existing MHPs or mental health professionals may have a very heavy caseload, which may cause delays in booking a first appointment. So risk measurement and assessment, we measure our impacts and probabilities. This can be a high probability and medium impact situation, but a number of factors could actually change the risk level. So if a counselor attempts to meet the 5-day limit no matter what, they could end up making mistakes, perhaps double booking clients. In that case, it's probably less likely that that would happen. So it would be medium probability, but it's certainly high impact. We always prioritize actions based on our understanding of impacts and probabilities. So remembering that dealing with health and wellness, acting and reacting quickly and decisively can be critical. Our response to risk. So we maintain open communication with our mental health professionals. We make sure that they're aware of our procedures and that they can feel free to inform us when they're close to being overbooked. We also explore alternate arrangements, including telephone and video counseling when appropriate or requested by our clients. So under risk monitoring and control, it's important to adapt our solution to the situation. So even in cases where counselors can no longer fulfill their obligations to newly assigned clients, either due to an illness or another personal matter, we can initiate a rush referral. So to ensure that clients do not have to wait longer than they already have. So in that case, we're still operating well within our timelines. Excuse me. So I'd like to take a few moments to discuss a process that I think demonstrates much of what we do at EAS to mitigate risk that may be associated with EAP network mental health professionals. So we randomly select counselors for site visits to ensure continued compliance with our procedures, processes, and best practices. And mental health professionals are already subject to audits by the professional associations anyway, but we feel that we add value by making sure that the rules and regulations specific to the federal government are adhered to. And those rules are often more rigorous than what exists in counselors' professional associations. So it can be perceived as an audit by some, but beyond that, we really want to make sure that it's an opportunity to connect with our EAP service providers and to listen to their concerns or suggestions. Actually, we do conduct an audit as well. We call that a periodic review, but that's something we do by looking at the data and how this relates to different performance indicators, like how long it would take a counselor to pick up a referral. But for site visits, there's a checklist, and we start by assessing the security of the counseling sites, so including the presence of smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, the ability to lock doors, soundproofing, cleanliness, accessibility, etc. We also look at measures taken to ensure that personal information is secure, so the presence of a locked cabinet, passwords on computers, the absence of identifiers on files. And we also review and inspect those client files to ensure that they comply with our policies and procedures. And then we basically just have a conversation. So we just want to see how the counselors like the program, if they're preoccupied with anything. It's a really good opportunity for us to gather that essential qualitative data. So overall, the site visit represents the holistic nature of risk identification and risk management procedures at EAS. In 1 hour, we're able to review different elements of a single process that exists during the entire work life of an EAP mental health professional. We make sure that they've integrated the program-specific training offered when they were hired. We look at their standing within their professional association. We examine client files, and we make sure that all the necessary documentation is there and that clients are looked after with the highest standard of quality. And I'll leave you with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balaji. Merci beaucoup. What's fascinating about your presentation is that you at one point mentioned that you don't have a formal risk management steps, but you truly do. While the client and namely the public servants and their families are looking for a service at the front end, what you and your team are doing in the back end is critical to providing the quality, the high quality of service that we receive. And that is based on the risk management steps that you take. So merci beaucoup pour un autre bon exemple. Donc, nous sommes arrivés à la période des questions. Just a reminder, you can use the Q&A function on your screen to post a question. For our panelists, if you wouldn't mind coming on the screen, we have some really fascinating observations and questions that I'll share with you. We have about 15 minutes, so I've tried to bundle them. But first and foremost, to the panelists, here's a question for you. Is there value in assigning a weight to each risk? For example, using Scott's example, risk of tech was low probability, high impact. What if the risk of contracting COVID in the workplace was also low risk and high impact? If you have contradictory risks with the same risk assessment, how do you make a decision? So our panelists, if you wouldn't mind just appearing on the screen, and then someone can kick it off.
Maybe I could start with the one where there's contradictory risk assessment. So basically, I'm guessing it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations where you have, I'm going to go around on this path. If I do it, this can happen. But if I don't do it, this other risk can happen. In those cases, to me, what I've found in my experience is that the response to the risk that you've identified simply will not work. And the best option is to find another response to the risk. So in those cases, a lot of innovative thinking, a lot of out-of-the-box thinking is required. Again, if you look at it as an opportunity, that helps a lot in figuring out how you're going to respond to those risks. If you figure out, okay, how can we use this to improve the process or the project that we're working on, then it's not a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's actually, you're working on improving the situation down the road. So I think that's my answer for that portion of the question. For the other portion, I don't know, Scott, if you wanted to answer that one.
Yeah, I can, thanks so much. I can give my my opinion on it. I mean, it's not I think the question wasn't about technology. It's really about assessing risk and contradictory risk. I think for me, and sometimes it comes a little simple because some of us just think that way with risk all the time, and other ones that people have to really think it through on that, and it's finding the balance in that. It's hard to give. There is no one size fits all. Every example is really important to look at it. So when the question talks about the risk of contracting COVID in the workplace with high impact, let me just rephrase that a bit to respond to that example. From my opinion, what's the consequence? I know what high impact is sort of we're getting to, but it's about consequence. A lot of decisions we make, luckily, don't have a dire consequence. So, you can assess that, you can make some, even if it's high impact, in different thing. COVID potentially does, and I'm not going to weigh in on the opinion. It's not my expertise in that area, but I think it's understanding that situation and really looking at, impact is about consequence, and are you prepared to are we prepared, or whoever's making the decision prepared to accept a risk, even though it's low impact, with a consequence of a dire consequence. That's a big difference between the network going down, although that could lead into some serious decisions and impact human life in Canada, and the example I gave. But I think we need to look at it that way. Really look at it from each individual case, because there is a line and a threshold, and I come back to my point about who has the decision-making authority to make that. just make sure that, you know, whoever's making that is the right level to make that decision. They may not be the same ones assessing the risk. Assess the risk, bring it forward. If you have the authority, your position has that authority, then feel free to make it. Otherwise, you should need to make some recommendations and escalate that decision. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Scott. The next question is really interesting. Balaji, I'm going to ask you to lead off. You know, the presentations have focused on the risk of pursuing different options, the probability and the impact of taking specific courses of action, but there are also risks of not taking action or action being delayed. Again, the pandemic is used as an example. It provides examples of not initiating something can mean more deaths or a longer lockdown. I'd appreciate hearing the speaker's thoughts on opportunity costs of not taking action or taking delayed action, and how you factor this into your risk analysis and management. Balaji, did you want to try and kick that one off?
Yeah, absolutely. So coming from an operational background with, you know, offering services directly to clients, maybe there is a different reality here where we really can't afford to not tackle any issue head on. So we do have to offer the service. We do have to make sure that folks are looked after. So there's no way around it. The only thing we can do is basically compare sometimes risks, right? So if there is a risk in not delivering the service a certain way, we have to make sure that we focus on a solution that provides the best possible outcome, essentially. So if we're dealing with mental health, we're dealing with service delivery, we have to make sure that whatever solution we select is the one that will possibly lead to the best outcome. So there is no scenario where we do not address risk, and then that we don't anticipate that, or that we anticipate that we can overlook risk in delivering the services.
Thank you. There's another question, and Scott, I'm going to ask you to lead because you touched upon it in your presentation. You touched upon it on this issue of authority, and the question is, you know, what is the importance of communication in risk management? Quelle est l'importance de la communication dans la gestion des risques?
I was looking for the questioning as well, but I don't see it. If I can step back and add a little bit before I go there on
Sure.
the previous question as well, because I thought it was an excellent question that was asked about, you know, making the decision not to do anything. And there's a couple of things I wanted to add. I actually think of my three examples, and Madeline, and the world you live in, we could think of many of them ongoing today. I prefer not to speak to the examples that we're in the middle of right now as we evolve. But even those three examples I gave earlier on that, that I considered that. We considered that. And the last one, but we actually chose not to do nothing, not to do anything, not to do nothing, not to do anything in the current environment where we're having some network problems right now. The choice could have been, we could have restricted access right now. That'd be action. The action we took was do nothing and accept it. So that's an example where we actually did choose to do nothing. I think I go back to environment, I go back to risk tolerance, I go back to accountabilities and all of that. And because each of us have our own risk tolerance as humans. I actually, I'm kind of a fairly high risk tolerance, and I've always, when I was younger, probably now, I've been a bit of a gambler. That's a personal thing though. But now as a public servant, we need to bring that into our environment. It's not about my own tolerance. So what's the calculated risk we need to take? You know, don't take stupid risks. Be calculated and choose the risk you want to take. So we have to do that as management all the time. So I think in those examples, we actually chose not to do some things for exactly those reasons. On the question, Ian, can you give me the 10-second snapshot again?
Sure. It's around the importance of communication in risk management. Topic that you and I have discussed prior to the roles that we have.
Yeah, I think I'm not the expert in any of this. It's to me, that's one of the most important pieces though of risk. And you know, and I've sat there and we do it on communications actually is to me the epitome of managing this. They do risk communications all the time, and they look at that and understand around that. So I think we could all learn a bit from that. Even in my role now, I'm trying to work with some of my teams to actually put in place what is the risk communications about that. Risk is a factor within that, but what's the risk communications and what's the process working out there? Do we have the right decisions? How do we communicate the impacts, the risk quickly, intelligently? I think transparently is a big word, because there was a few questions when I was looking at the Q's and A's and a few comments about, and I think one of my predecessors, might have been Ian even spoke about not articulating maybe some of the risks out there because you don't sure what the impact, or maybe you're not sure that folks want to hear that. I'm against paralysis by analysis, but I think we need to make quick decisions, articulate what we know, be transparent on that, and get at that. The more we hide, if you're going to hide something, do you have the accountability to actually to not share that, because it will come back. Eventually, it all comes out, and we need to make good informed decisions. And at the end of the day, that's what we as public servants, talking about, I think in Joseph's piece, or one of them early on, it talked about as public servants, it's about trust. And I think at the end of the day, by establishing those and establishing, okay, here's the facts, here's the best choices we can make, even in a very difficult time, we have to make choices. And here's the assessment. I think we can make good choices that maybe in hindsight, that might have been different, but given the context and the environment we're in at that moment, I think they'll stand the test of time.
Yeah, thanks for that, Scott. A very informative answer. We have time probably for one more question, and it's a scenario. So just bear with me. This is one of the attendees' experience, in that they've managed a major project in which they were tasked with drafting an issues analysis, which essentially is a risk analysis, including options to move forward. And after they flagged to the management that the environmental scan was not conducted, and after flagging to management that an environmental scan was not conducted and absolutely necessary to effectively identify the issues to propose appropriate actions, it wasn't well received. Their words were they were brushed off and told it wasn't necessary. It had major implications on all the deliverables and would ultimately impact the entire program. So the question is, how do you mitigate this and convince management, this is manager director, to take a few steps back in order to have a good and relevant deliverable? The project, unfortunately, was riddled with issues as a result. This person goes on to say, on a positive note, the team did learn that moving forward, when they are in a decision-making position, to do things differently. So this is about the identification of risk, but I guess it's in conflict with the overall receptivity or the perspective from a management perspective about the actual risk itself. So I go back to the slide that you had, Scott, about low impact, low risk, deep impact. How do you get that messaging across? I think it ties back into your communications and transparency. So that's a general question to the panel. Anyone can go and take a stab at that one.
I'll go real quick because I can take too much time. We all know that. But it's a really great question, and there's no perfect answer for any of this. But I will say, asking others and getting us opinion without you can do it quickly is always a good piece. I will say, even the way it's framed, though, someone else always has a different perspective. Mm. Like, I could actually put myself in that shoes and be the manager director and have someone trying to convince me. Context is everything. And I think it's not about, we all have a limited view of what we know, and others have a broader view. And, and I run into it all the time. And so engage in that conversation, be open and transparent about what you're thinking about it, how you've assessed it, what you're bringing. I go back to that again, transparency and being open. But also recognize that, others are looking at different factors that you may not know, that you may not be considering. And I think that's really important when we talk about how do we convince management. I think the litmus test I always say to myself is, can I look myself in the mirror and know that I've done my job and I've done it well, and I've conveyed the information I need to convey so the right decision can be made. And it isn't always the decision that I agree with, but that doesn't matter. Have I done my job? And if I can do that, if we get, that's sort of my personal litmus test, because I think if we're not doing that, then what could I have done differently to actually improve, to weigh in on that decision? And because it comes down to whose authority is it to make the decision. So I'm just going to stop there and just throw some of those things out.
Thank you. So Joseph, 1 minute, and then Balaji, 1 minute, please.
So for me, I think Scott kind of touched on this, is making sure that the roles and responsibilities are clearly laid out. Whose job is it to identify and present those risks, and whose job is it to make the decision on that risk? In your presentation of what those risks can be, make sure you identify, this is the probability, this is the impact, make sure that it's properly identified in your documentation. Whoever's accountable, they make that decision. And once that decision is made, make sure it's documented. If you disagree, you don't necessarily need to document that, but just say, this was the decision made on this particular risk. And you have clearly identified in your documents who's accountable for that decision. Of course, if it's something that impacts, if it's an ethical decision, if something clearly wrong is being done, yes, extra steps can be taken, and we all know what can be done in those cases. But if it's for a project, you think, this risk is higher than my manager is taking account, is saying, like Scott said, they may have different perspective. They may be right, they may be wrong, absolutely. But as long as it's properly documented, so that everyone's covering what their role and responsibility was.
Thank you, Joseph. And Balaji, final word to you in a minute, please.
Absolutely. I don't have much to add, except that really communication is key, and it comes down to knowing your audience. So the personality type, who you're dealing with, how to communicate to that person effectively. It's not a one size fits all. It's important to know who you're talking to and how to adapt to that style. So that's essentially what I would recommend.
So thank you for that response to all three of you. We are quickly approaching the end of the session. So I'd just like to take a moment to thank our three panelists for taking the time to join us today and share their perspective, their experience, and their wisdom with us. Donc, j'aimerais remercier nos trois panélistes d'avoir pris le temps de nous communiquer précédemment. Aussi important, et je remercie profondément tous ceux qui ont participé à cette session de parcours de leaders. We will follow up this session with an email to all the participants with the materials that have been presented today, so you will get copies, which will also be posted on the Leaders Path, the GCpedia page. Also in the email that we're sending out, there will be an evaluation included, and we encourage you to complete it so that we can get your feedback on today's event. Après la séance, nous enverrons un courriel aux participants incluant les documents présentés aujourd'hui, lequel sera également affiché sur la page GCpedia de parcours de leader. Dans ce courriel, un formulaire d'évaluation sera inclus. Nous vous encourageons à la remplir afin que nous puissions obtenir vos commentaires sur l'événement aujourd'hui. Take a very quick look at the poll. Two questions were, have you ever performed a formal risk assessment for your proposals, processes, or project? Avez-vous déjà effectué une évaluation officielle des risques pour vos propositions, process ou projets? 60% of you have done so, 31% of you have not, and 9 of you aren't quite sure. Do you believe your organizational unit does enough to manage risk? Croyez-vous que votre unité organisationnelle en face avait pour gérer les risques? 13% of you, 13% of you does more than enough to manage risk. 35% of you does a sufficient amount. You say does a sufficient amount. And then there's 32% of you believe your unit should do more. 1% says no, and then 18% aren't sure. So very interesting perspective. I think that You know, the topic of risk is always timely, but even more so given what we are going through at the moment. And just a reminder before I close things off to include your key leadership competencies in your performance management agreements. There was a detailed email that was sent out from the ADM on this topic. You can find that on the GCpedia page if you don't have access to it right now. Je vous rappelle également d'inclure vos compétences clés en leadership dans vos ententes de gestion de rendement, comme l'indique le courriel que vous avez reçu de SMA. C'est disponible aussi sur la page de GCpedia à Parcours de Leader. In conclusion, the next Leaders Path event is planned for November, and it will be on the topic of organizational awareness and telling our story. Donc, la prochaine activité, Parcours de Leader, est prévue en novembre et elle portera sur la sensibilisation organisationnelle et la narration de notre histoire. For now, I want to thank you all again, all the participants, our panelists as well. Wishing you a great afternoon. Je vous remercie encore une fois et passez un excellent après-midi. Bonne journée tout le monde.